December 1944. A starving German soldier, captured at the Battle of the Bulge and weighing just 120 pounds, stepped off a transport ship in America expecting execution. Instead, guards handed him a meal larger than his entire weekly ration back home, then casually threw half of it away. Within weeks, he'd be assigned to a Nebraska farm where he'd witness endless fields of wheat, taste ice cream for the first time in years, and sit down to Thanksgiving dinner with the enemy who prayed for his safe return home. But how could a nation he was taught to believe was weak and decadent possess such staggering abundance? And would this impossible contrast completely shatter everything the Third Reich had told him about who the real enemy was? December 1944. Hans Müller crouched in a frozen foxhole somewhere in Belgium, his hands shaking from cold and hunger. He was 22 years old, but his body felt like it belonged to an old man. His uniform hung loose on his frame. 3 months ago, he weighed 160 pounds. Now, he was down to 120. The German army had stopped sending regular food weeks ago. Sometimes they got bread, sometimes the bread had sawdust mixed in to make it stretch further. Hans could feel the grit between his teeth when he chewed. Back home in Bavaria, his mother was probably eating even less. The cities were being bombed every night. The farms had been stripped clean by the army. Children dug through garbage looking for potato peels. His sister wrote him a letter in October, saying she had not seen butter in 6 months. She said the younger kids no longer remembered what chocolate tasted like. Hans kept that letter folded in his pocket until it fell apart from being read too many times. The Nazis had told him America was weak. They said Americans were soft and lazy. They said American soldiers could not fight, and American factories made cheap junk that broke easily. Hans believed them because everyone believed them. What else could you do? If you questioned the party, you disappeared. Hans had seen it happen to his neighbor, a shopkeeper who complained about the war. 2 men in long coats came at night. The shopkeeper never came back. His shop stayed closed, the windows dark. Hans had been a farmer before the war. His family grew wheat and barley on 30 acres outside a small village. He knew how to work hard. He knew the feel of soil in his hands and the rhythm of seasons. Then, in 1943, the army came to his village and took every man between 18 and 40. They gave him a rifle and 6 weeks of training. They told him he was fighting for Germany's future. They told him the enemy wanted to destroy everything German, that they were animals who showed no mercy. Now he was trapped in a foxhole during the Battle of the Bulge, and the Americans were winning. Hans could hear their tanks getting closer. The sound was like thunder that never stopped. His company had started with 140 men. Now there were maybe 30 left. His captain had been killed 2 days ago. Nobody knew who was in charge anymore. They just waited and hoped they would survive another hour. On December 18th, the Americans surrounded them. Hans heard someone shout in German to surrender. He looked at the men around him. They were boys, really. 17, 18 years old. Their faces were gray with cold and fear. One of them was crying silently, tears freezing on his cheeks. Hans raised his hands above his head and stood up. The others followed. American soldiers rushed forward, shouting words Hans did not understand. They searched him for weapons, took his knife and his canteen. Hans waited for a bullet. He had heard the propaganda. The Americans shot prisoners. Everyone knew that. But the bullet never came. Instead, a soldier handed him a blanket and pointed toward a truck. Hans climbed in with the other prisoners. Nobody spoke. They were too afraid and too tired. The journey to the coast took 3 days. They rode in trucks, then trains, then trucks again. Hans saw American towns through the truck windows. The buildings were not bombed. The shops had glass in the windows and signs advertising food. He saw children playing in the streets, fat and healthy, wearing clean clothes. He saw cars everywhere, more cars than he had ever seen in his life. In Germany, only rich people and party officials had cars. Here, it seemed like everyone had one. At the port, they loaded Hans and 200 other prisoners onto a Liberty ship. The ship was massive, bigger than any building in his village. The crossing took 12 days. The prisoners slept in bunks below deck. It was crowded and it smelled bad, but it was warm. They gave him 2 meals a day. The food was strange. Canned meat that came in rectangular tins. White bread that was soft and sweet. Some kind of vegetable stew. It was not much, but it was more than he had eaten in months. His stomach hurt from eating after being empty for so long. The other prisoners whispered at night. Some said the Americans were taking them to prison camps where they would work until they died. Others said they would be executed when they arrived. A few said maybe the Americans would be decent, but those men were told to shut up. Nobody wanted to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope made things worse when it was destroyed. Hans did not know what to think. He watched the American sailors working on the ship. They seemed relaxed, like they were not at war. They laughed and joked with each other. During one meal, Hans saw a sailor eating a sandwich. The sandwich was huge, stuffed with meat and cheese and lettuce. The sailor took a few bites, then threw the rest into the ocean, just threw it away. Hans stared. That sandwich was more food than his family had seen in a week, and this man tossed it into the water like it was nothing. The ship arrived at Norfolk, Virginia, on a cold morning in January 1945. Hans walked down the gangway with the other prisoners, his legs weak and unsteady. American guards stood waiting, rifles ready. They loaded the prisoners onto buses. Through the window, Hans saw his first glimpse of America. Wide streets, cars everywhere, shops with bright signs, and people. Regular people walking around in thick coats, carrying packages, looking fed and healthy and completely untouched by war. The bus drove for hours into North Carolina, finally stopping at a place called Camp Butner. Guards marched them through the gates into rows of wooden barracks. Everything was organized and clean. Then they took Hans to a building and handed him a metal tray. A man behind a counter loaded the tray with food. So much food. Roast beef, a pile of white mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy, green beans, 2 thick slices of white bread with butter, and a piece of pie. Apple pie with a golden crust. Hans stood there holding the tray, unable to move. He thought it was a mistake. This much food could feed his whole family for 3 days. He looked at the other prisoners. They had the same confused, frightened expressions. Was this a trick? Some kind of test? Hans sat down at a long table and ate slowly, waiting for someone to take it away. Nobody did. When he finished, his stomach hurt again. Too full, too fast. He had not eaten this much food at one time in over a year. That night, lying in his bunk, Hans thought about the sandwich thrown into the ocean. He thought about the endless cars and the bright shops and the tray of food that nobody took away. And he began to wonder if everything they told him about America had been a lie. The meals kept coming. Every single day, 3 times a day, they fed the prisoners more food than Hans thought possible. Breakfast was eggs and bacon and toast with jam. Lunch was sandwiches with thick slices of ham and cheese. Dinner was always meat and potatoes and vegetables and bread and dessert. Always dessert. Cake or pie or pudding or cookies. Hans gained 12 pounds in the first month. His uniform started to fit again. The gray color left his face. Other prisoners looked the same, filling out, getting stronger, unable to believe what was happening to them. In March, the Americans started sending prisoners out to work. They needed farm labor because so many American men were overseas fighting. Hans volunteered immediately. Anything was better than sitting behind wire fence thinking about home. They put him on a train heading west with 40 other prisoners and 2 guards. The train had real seats, not cargo cars. The windows were clean. Hans watched America roll past for 3 days. He saw cities that had no bomb damage. He saw towns with churches and schools still standing. He saw farms everywhere, stretching across flat land as far as he could see. Farms with painted barns and metal silos and tractors working in fields. So many tractors. In his village, they had 1 tractor for the whole area, and it broke down constantly. Here, he counted 6 tractors in a single field. They arrived in Nebraska in early April. A farmer named Robert Henderson picked up Hans and 3 other prisoners in a truck. Henderson was maybe 50 years old, with rough hands and a sunburned face. He looked like a man who worked hard. He drove them to his farm, which was 20 miles from the nearest town. The farmhouse was white with a front porch. There was a barn painted red and 3 tall silos and a chicken coop and fields of wheat that went on forever. Henderson showed them to a small bunkhouse behind the barn. It had beds with clean sheets and a stove for heat and a table with chairs. It was nicer than anywhere Hans had lived since before the war. The next morning, Henderson woke them at 5. They ate breakfast in the farmhouse kitchen. Henderson's wife cooked pancakes and sausage and poured them coffee with real cream and sugar. She was a small woman with kind eyes who smiled at them even though they were the enemy. She set the food on the table and said something in English that Hans did not understand, but her tone was welcoming. After breakfast, Henderson took them out to the fields. He pointed at the wheat, which was just starting to grow, green shoots pushing up through dark soil. He showed them the tractors and the equipment. He gave Hans a pair of work gloves. They worked 12 hours that first day, preparing fields and fixing fence and cleaning equipment. It was hard work, but it was good work. Hans knew farming. His body remembered the rhythm of it. At lunch, Henderson's wife brought sandwiches and lemonade out to the field. The sandwiches had roast beef and lettuce and tomato, stacked thick between slices of soft bread. The lemonade was cold and sweet. Hans sat in the shade of a tractor and ate and looked at the wheat fields stretching toward the horizon. He tried to count the acres but lost track. Maybe 400 acres, maybe 500. His family's whole farm back home was 30 acres. And they thought that was good land. That evening after dinner, Henderson drove Hans and the others into town. It was Saturday, and the guards said prisoners could attend church services if they wanted. Hans went because he had nothing else to do. The church was small and made of white wood with a tall steeple. Inside, American families sat in wooden pews singing hymns. Nobody stared at the prisoners. Nobody moved away from them. After the service, an old woman shook Hans's hand and said something he did not understand, but she was smiling. A man in a suit patted his shoulder. They treated him like a regular person, not like an enemy, not like a monster. On his second Sunday at the farm, something happened that Hans would remember for the rest of his life. Henderson's wife served them iced tea with their lunch. Hans had never had iced tea before. It was sweet and cold, with ice cubes floating in a tall glass. He drank it slowly, amazed that they had ice in April, amazed that they used ice for drinks instead of saving it for important things. Then Henderson's wife brought out a plate of cookies, still warm from the oven. Chocolate chip cookies. She set them on the table and told the prisoners to help themselves. Hans took one cookie. It was soft and warm, and the chocolate melted on his tongue. He thought about his sister's letter, about the children who no longer remembered chocolate. He almost cried right there at the table. In May, a truck arrived at the farm. It was painted red and white with words on the side. Coca-Cola. Hans knew that word from propaganda posters. American decadence. American waste. The driver unloaded cases of bottles and left them by the barn. Henderson told the prisoners they could have one bottle each after work. Hans opened his bottle and took a sip. It was cold and fizzy and sweet, like nothing he had ever tasted. It made his nose tickle. He drank it slowly, trying to make it last. That night in the bunkhouse, one of the other prisoners said they were being treated better than German officers ate in Berlin. Nobody disagreed. By June, the wheat was tall and golden, moving in waves when the wind blew. Hans worked alongside Henderson in the fields, learning how to operate the combine harvester. Henderson was patient, showing him the controls, trusting him with expensive equipment. Sometimes Henderson would stop and talk, using simple English words and hand gestures. He asked about Hans's family. He asked about farming in Germany. He showed Hans pictures of his own son, who was fighting somewhere in France. His son was the same age as Hans. Henderson did not seem angry about it. He just seemed sad, like the whole war was a terrible mistake that hurt everyone. One evening, Henderson gave Hans a book about modern farming techniques. It had pictures of crop rotation and soil management and irrigation systems. Henderson pointed at the book, then at Hans, then made a gesture like giving a gift. Hans understood. The book was his to keep. He stayed up late that night, looking at the pictures by lamplight, thinking about wheat fields that stretched forever, about ice cream and Coca-Cola trucks and chocolate chip cookies, about a people so rich they threw sandwiches into the ocean, and he began to understand something that frightened him. Everything they told him was backwards. America was not weak. Germany was not strong. They had sent him to fight a giant, and they had lied about how big the giant was. November 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 6 months, but Hans was still in Nebraska. The harvest was done. The wheat had been cut and stored in the silos, thousands of bushels worth more money than Hans could imagine. Henderson said Hans could stay through the winter if he wanted. There was always work to do on a farm. Hans said yes because he was not ready to go home yet. He was not ready to face what home had become. The guards told the prisoners that Camp Butner was planning something special for Thanksgiving. It was an American holiday, they explained, a day for being grateful and eating too much food. Hans did not understand why anyone needed a special day just for eating, but he had learned to stop being surprised by American excess. On Thanksgiving morning, they loaded all the prisoners onto buses and drove them back to the main camp. Hundreds of prisoners gathered there from farms all across Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa. They filled a huge dining hall with long tables covered in white paper. Hans sat down and waited. The smell coming from the kitchen was incredible. Rich and savory and sweet all mixed together. Then the servers started bringing out the food. Turkey. Whole roasted turkeys, golden brown and glistening, bigger than any chicken Hans had ever seen. They carved the meat right there at the table, thick slices of white and dark meat. Then came bowls of mashed potatoes and gravy and stuffing and sweet potatoes with melted marshmallows on top. There were green beans and corn and rolls with butter and something called cranberry sauce that was red and jiggly, and pie, so many pies. Pumpkin and apple and cherry with towers of whipped cream. Hans filled his plate, then he filled it again. The turkey was moist and tender. The potatoes were creamy and smooth. Everything tasted better than it had any right to taste. Around him, other prisoners ate in silence, their faces showing the same confusion and shame that Hans felt. This was supposed to be the enemy. These were the people they had tried to kill. And here they were, serving a feast to the men who had lost, treating them better than their own country ever had. After the meal, a local pastor stood up to speak. An interpreter translated his words into German. The pastor said he was thankful the war was over. He said he was thankful for peace. Then he said something that made Hans's throat tighten. He said he was praying for all the German prisoners, praying that they would find their way home safely to their families, praying that they would help build a better Germany, a Germany without hate, a Germany that could be friends with America someday. The pastor's voice was gentle and sincere. He meant every word. Hans put his fork down. His hands were shaking. He looked around the room at all the other prisoners, at the American soldiers serving them food, at the pastor with his kind face. And something inside him broke. Not broke like shattering. Broke like a dam breaking, like something that had been holding back too much pressure for too long. They were never the enemy. We were lied to. Everything was a lie. Hans put his head in his hands and cried. Other men around him were crying too. Nobody tried to hide it. There was too much to hide from anymore. The next week, the guards started re-education classes. Attendance was required. They gathered prisoners in a classroom and showed them newspapers. American newspapers, British newspapers, even some German newspapers that were now being printed in the occupied zones. The newspapers had pictures, photographs of concentration camps, piles of bodies, skeletal prisoners behind wire fences, gas chambers, mass graves. The guards said these camps were in Germany and Poland. They said millions of people had been killed there, Jews and Poles and Russians and anyone the Nazis did not like. Hans stared at the photographs. Some of the other prisoners got angry. They said the photos were fake, American propaganda, lies meant to make Germans feel guilty. A man named Friedrich, who had been in the Hitler Youth, shouted that it was all fake. He said the Americans were trying to break their spirits. He said they should be proud of what Germany tried to do. Hans wanted to believe Friedrich. It would be easier to believe the photos were fake. But he looked at the pictures again, really looked at them, and he knew they were real. Nobody could fake that much death. Nobody could fake the look in those prisoners' eyes. He thought about the sandwich thrown into the ocean. He thought about the endless wheat fields and the ice cream and the Thanksgiving turkey. He thought about Henderson's wife smiling at him, even though her son was fighting Germans in France. He thought about how much food America had, how much they made, how much they wasted, how much they gave away. And he understood. America did not defeat Germany with cruelty. They did not win by being more evil or more ruthless. They won because they had more of everything. More food, more factories, more trucks, more planes, more tanks, more people, more resources, more of everything that mattered in a war. Germany never had a chance. The war was lost before it started. And they sent millions of men to die for a lie. Hans started reading everything the Americans gave him: newspapers about democracy and free elections, pamphlets about human rights and freedom of speech, books about American history, about how they built their country, about their constitution and their laws. He learned that in America you could criticize the government without disappearing in the night. You could vote for whoever you wanted. You could say what you thought. You could be different and nobody cared. It sounded impossible, but he had seen it. He had lived it for 8 months on Henderson's farm. In December, Henderson came to visit before Hans was scheduled to return to Germany. He brought the farming book he had given Hans months earlier, now carefully wrapped in brown paper and string, so it would survive the journey home. Henderson also brought a letter written in simple English that Hans could barely read. The interpreter helped. The letter said Hans was welcome to come back to Nebraska any time after Germany was free again. It said there would always be work on the farm for a good man who knew wheat. Henderson shook Hans's hand for a long time, then pulled him into a brief hug. Hans could not find words in any language. That night, Hans wrote in a journal he had started keeping, using pencil and paper Henderson's wife had given him. He wrote in German, small, careful letters. "I came here a soldier of the Reich. I thought I knew who the enemy was. Now I know I fought for a lie, and the enemy showed me more kindness than my own leaders ever did. I do not know what Germany will become, but I know what it must never be again." Spring 1946. Hans stood on the deck of a transport ship watching the German coast appear through morning fog. He was going home after 16 months as a prisoner of war. His duffel bag held everything he owned in the world: 3 changes of clothes, a pair of work boots Henderson had given him, 6 cans of American meat, a bag of coffee, a bar of chocolate, the farming book wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and Henderson's letter folded inside his shirt pocket close to his heart. The other prisoners around him were quiet. Nobody cheered, nobody celebrated. They were returning to a country that no longer existed. The ship docked at Bremerhaven. What had once been a busy port city was now mostly rubble. Broken buildings lined the waterfront like rotting teeth. Cranes stood frozen and twisted from bombing. The air smelled like dust and decay and something else Hans could not name. Maybe it was the smell of defeat. German officials checked their papers and processed them through long tables. Everything was slow and disorganized. Nobody seemed to be in charge. The officials looked thin and tired, wearing mismatched uniforms that did not fit right. After 6 hours of waiting, Hans was free to go. He walked through Bremerhaven, looking for the train station. Every street was damaged. Piles of bricks and concrete blocked sidewalks. Buildings had their fronts torn off so you could see inside the rooms. Furniture still in place, wallpaper hanging in strips. Children played in the ruins, their clothes patched and dirty. Women in headscarves dug through debris looking for anything useful. An old man pushed a cart full of broken wood, probably for burning. Nobody looked at Hans. Nobody cared that he was home. Everyone was too busy trying to survive. The train to Bavaria took 3 days because the tracks were damaged in so many places. Sometimes the train stopped for hours while workers cleared rubble from the rails. Sometimes it stopped, and nobody knew why. Hans shared a crowded car with other refugees and returning soldiers. They had no food except what they carried. Hans ate 1 can of American meat each day, opening it carefully with his pocket knife, making it last. The people around him watched him eat with hollow eyes. On the 2nd day, he opened a can and shared it with a woman holding a baby. The woman cried when she ate. The meat was gone in seconds. His village appeared on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Hans walked the last 5 miles because no trucks were running. He knew something was wrong when he crested the hill above town. Too many buildings were missing. The church steeple was gone. Half the houses on the main street were collapsed. As he got closer, he saw that his family's farm had been burned. The barn was a black skeleton. The house was still standing, but the roof was partially caved in. The fields were empty and overgrown with weeds. His mother was living in 2 rooms of the house that still had a roof. She was 53 years old, but looked 70. Her hair had gone completely white. Her face was thin and lined with deep wrinkles. When she saw Hans walking up the road, she ran to him crying his name. They held each other for a long time in the yard, where he used to play as a child. She felt so small and fragile in his arms, like she might break. She kept touching his face to make sure he was real. Inside, she told him everything. His father had died in January 1945 during an air raid in Munich. He had gone to the city looking for work and never came back. Hans's sister had married a soldier who was now missing somewhere in Russia. She had moved to her husband's family's farm in the next valley. The Nazis had taken most of their animals in 1944. When the Americans came through in April 1945, there was fighting near the village. The barn caught fire. Nobody knew how. Everything they had stored for winter burned. Neighbors had helped her survive by sharing what little they had. Hans emptied his duffel bag on the kitchen table, the canned meat and the coffee and the chocolate. His mother stared at the cans like they were treasure. She picked up the coffee and smelled it and started crying again. Hans told her there were 5 other families in the village who had helped keep her alive. They would share everything. His mother nodded. That evening, Hans walked through the village delivering cans of meat to the families who had fed his mother through the winter. The families wept. One woman held the can against her chest like it was a baby. A man shook Hans's hand over and over, saying thank you in a broken voice. An old woman looked at the label written in English and asked where he had been. Hans said, America. The woman said, then you were the lucky one. The next morning, Hans walked to his father's grave in the village cemetery. Someone had made a simple wooden cross with his father's name carved into it. Hans stood there holding his cap in his hands, trying to find words. He wanted to tell his father about Nebraska and Henderson and the wheat fields that went on forever. He wanted to explain what he had learned, but the words would not come. Instead, he just said, I'm sorry. Sorry for the war. Sorry for the lies. Sorry for all of it. Over the next months, Hans worked to rebuild. He cleared the burned barn. He fixed the house roof using wood from collapsed buildings in the village. He planted wheat in the fields using seeds he traded for with his American coffee. Other men came to help, veterans like him who had nowhere else to go. They worked together clearing land and sharing tools and trying to make something grow in soil that had been neglected for too long. Hans taught them things he learned in Nebraska: crop rotation, soil testing, modern planting methods from Henderson's book. The other men listened because Hans was the only one who had seen how real farming worked in a country that was not starving. In 1947, the village started a collective farm. 6 families pooled their land and resources. Hans helped organize it, using ideas from America about cooperation and shared equipment. It was not easy. Nothing was easy in Germany after the war. But slowly, things got better. The fields started producing again. The village began to heal. Hans never spoke about the war with pride. When people asked what he did during the war, he just said he was captured and spent time working on a farm. He did not talk about the fighting or the ideology or the lies. He only talked about wheat and soil and the kindness of strangers. In 1983, a journalist came to interview Hans for a project about POWs. By then, Hans was 61 years old, a grandfather, respected in his community for helping rebuild the local farms. The journalist asked what he learned from being a prisoner in America. Hans thought for a long time before answering. Then he said this, I went to America a soldier of the Reich. I came home a farmer who understood something I was never taught. A nation's strength is not in its armies, but in what it can grow and build and share. I saw their fields, endless and golden and free, and I knew we had lost long before the first shot was fired. They did not defeat us with cruelty. They defeated us by being everything we were told they were not. In 1989, Hans's daughter and her 2 children visited America. They drove to Nebraska and found Henderson's farm. Henderson had died years before, but his son, the one who fought in France, still ran the place. The son remembered the German POW his father always talked about, the young man who loved farming and wanted to learn. He took Hans's family out to the wheat fields, the same fields Hans had worked 44 years earlier. Hans's grandchildren ran through the rows of golden wheat, laughing and playing while their mother cried. That night, the son gave them a photograph he had found in his father's papers. It showed Henderson and Hans standing by a tractor, both smiling, both squinting in the bright summer sun. On the back, Henderson had written, Hans Müller, summer 1945, a good man. Hans's daughter framed that photograph and hung it in her home in Bavaria. It stayed there for the rest of her life, a reminder that even in the darkest times, human decency could survive, and that sometimes the enemy was the one who taught you what it meant to be free.